Amazing. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here and speak with you all. I plan to speak for around 30 to 35 minutes, and then hopefully we have some time for questions and discussions after. So I should also mention that what I'm about to present is based on a paper. This was joint work with Arvind Narayanan and others at Princeton University. Okay, so I want to start with somewhat of a contradiction that is facing us in AI today. On the one hand, we see AI has clearly led to genuine scientific advances. This year's Nobel Prizes in both physics and chemistry, to some extent, were awarded to advances in AI. And at the same time, what we're also seeing is widespread and rampant claims about AI not working as expected. So for example, we've seen a slew of cases, as the slide here shows, of lawyers misusing ChatGPT. In some cases, this leads to hallucinations, and many of these lawyers have later been sanctioned for their use of AI. We've also seen other issues in science itself. So there have been many claims that AI and machine learning are leading to a reproducibility crisis across fields like political science, in healthcare, and so on. So how do we square these two? How do we sort of reconcile the fact that on the one hand, AI has made genuine advances, and on the other, we see many of these issues occurring again and again. So through this talk, I sort of aim to reconcile these two. And the key message of the talk is that in order to be useful to domain experts like lawyers, AI needs better evaluations. But that the current state of evaluations allows us to say pretty little about how useful AI can be in some of the most consequential settings where its use has been claimed. So over the course of the talk, we'll look at three main types of legal applications. The first is applications of AI that require information processing. For instance, these are tasks like summarization or translation, transcription, e-discovery, and so on. The second is tasks that require creativity, reasoning, and judgment. So these can be things like preparing a legal filing, research assistance with a case, dispute resolution, and so on. And finally, we look at AI that's used for predicting future. So these include tasks like criminal risk prediction in criminal justice, as well as predicting the outcomes of court decisions. So let's dive into each in turn, and we can start with information processing. So with information processing, we have tasks that are somewhat routine, that have sort of been around for a long time, like summarizing cases or translation and so on. And it turns out that models like large language models like ChatGPT can indeed be used for most of these tasks. They can summarize text, they can translate and transcribe things, help with the discovery, and so on. But it's crucial to remember that special purpose software, especially in the legal domain, has long been able to do these tasks as well. For example, here's an article from the New York Times back in 2011, where the article was titled, Armies of Expensive Lawyers Replaced by Cheaper Software. So the potential for AI in e-discovery was highlighted. What's new, though, is that a single tool, like a single language model, can be instructed in English or in natural language to perform any of these tasks. Now, tools like this would indeed be very useful for laypeople. But in a domain like legal applications, where when someone is doing, let's say, e-discovery, a specific purpose tool has already existed for decades at this point. So while AI can be revolutionary when it comes to lay people using it for information processing, it's more of an evolution than a revolution when it comes to experts like judges or lawyers or other legal experts. And even when we're using AI for simple tasks, for information processing tasks, the problem of hallucination remains. So hallucination briefly refers to AI models fabricating outputs, that is outputting correct, that is content that is incorrect. A rough intuition for why this happens is because language models generate text incrementally. So if there's error in the first part of the text, so if a language model starts outputting something that turns out to be incorrect, they keep outputting text, taking that error for granted. Another reason, another rough intuition for why this happens or why hallucinations are common is because language models are trained to sound convincing. And in their attempt to sound convincing, they sometimes lose out on factuality. Now, there are many sort of ongoing research directions in terms of improving hallucinations. But a big question for a lot of AI research is, how soon will AI hallucination be solved? I think a full solution is unlikely for the foreseeable future because we don't really have any working solutions or even prototypes of solutions that work reasonably well across domains. Okay, so this was the first sort of type or category of legal applications. The second category of legal applications are tasks involving creativity, reasoning, and judgment. So these include things like preparing a legal filing, research assistance, and so on. Compared to the first category of tasks, compared to information processing, if AI were indeed able to perform well on this type of task, this could have a huge impact on the future of the field. And this is indeed what a lot of people have claimed. So when OpenAI released the latest version of its language models, GPT-4, the company sort of claimed that the model passes the bar exam, which is the US license exam for lawyers, at the 90th percentile. So it did better than 90% of the humans who took the test. Another example is this company called Do Not Pay. This company claimed to have built the world's first robot lawyer. In fact, on the bottom left, you'll see that in January of last year, the CEO of the company, Joshua Browder, claimed that the company would pay any lawyer $1 million for arguing a case in front of the US Supreme Court. So headlines like these might make you think that, we are making huge progress when it comes to tasks involving creativity, reasoning, and judgment. But unfortunately, the reality is much sadder than all of this hype. In the past few months, we've seen many examples of hallucinations. And to top that off, claims like the world's first robot lawyer were basically disbanded earlier this year when the US Federal Trade Commission went after Do Not Pay, and Do Not Pay was fined for misleading customers by claiming that it had built the world's first robot lawyer. A key thing to keep in mind here is that while hallucination is a problem for information processing tasks as well, like the first category of tasks we looked at, when we have open-ended tasks like creativity, reasoning, or judgment, hallucinations can be much worse for these kinds of tasks, simply because there are no easy ways to verify if an answer is correct. So an expert literally has to go back and manually check if each of these things was correctly written. So what explains the difference between all of the hype about AI for creativity, reasoning, and judgment versus the reality that we saw, where a lot of lawyers and legal experts are struggling to come up with ways to use AI effectively? I think there are three key reasons, and we'll go over each of them in turn. The first is that hallucinations are much worse for open-ended tasks. So if you look at this slide, you'll see over like a half a dozen cases of lawyers across the world being sanctioned for using models that hallucinate. And the key thing here is to remember that humans have a tendency to over-rely on automated systems. What this means is when using an algorithm or on an automated decision-making system, it is very likely for humans to sort of give into the system if it tries to behave reasonably. And this is what has led to this large number of hallucinated cases, because these are things that sound very reasonable when they come out of ChatGPT, but unfortunately, the citations, for example, might be incorrect. And we have strong laws in many jurisdictions around not citing incorrect text or not writing incorrect text, which is submitted to the courthouse. And this is actually what has led to so many lawyers across countries being reprimanded for incorrect hallucinated texts outputted by language models. So this is one major gap between the hype and the reality. The second gap is the impact of leakage. Now, leakage basically means teaching to the test. So essentially, when AI models are trained, they are trained on a certain set of data. And if they're evaluated or tested on the same data that they were trained on, they can essentially perform very, very well in a way that does not reflect their real-world performance. So this is something like having the answers to a real-world exam or a real-world test before you take it. If you have the answers, you might do very well on the exam, but you won't really have gained the knowledge that the test is intended to evaluate. This is also something that happens in AI models. So for example, let's start with this very simplistic sort of question on computer vision. Can machine learning models distinguish a wolf from a dog? So here's what I mean by that. Given enough images of wolves, like the one on the left, and dogs, like the one on the right, can a state-of-the-art machine learning model distinguish between the two? The answer is indeed yes. We have a lot of image classifiers that do pretty well when it comes to looking at images and detecting similar images. But what happens when we flip the background? What happens if the wolf, instead of, as in the earlier image, being in a snowy field, is now on a grassy field, and the dog, instead of being in a grassy field, is now on a snowy field? Now, it turns out that if the model is trained only on images of wolves lying in snowy fields and only on images of dogs lying in grassy fields, then the model might get confused here. The model might output the incorrect response. It might tag the wolf as the dog and the dog as the wolf. And the reason behind this is that machine learning models rely on correlations to get their outputs. They rely on correlations in the data set. So if there are correlations like, all wolves are on snowy fields and all dogs are on grassy fields, then the models pick this up and they use this to make their prediction. And it's really hard to control for the effect of this background using machine learning models. So this is one example of leakage. Maybe let's walk through a few more to develop an intuition. The most obvious example of leakage is when there is no difference between what the model is trained on, what data the model is trained on, and what data it is evaluated on. And this results in highly over-optimistic performance estimates. So ideally, when you're building a machine learning model and you have a data set, you would split it with some data going into the training set and some into the test set. If you don't do this, this is a textbook example of leakage. So this is one of the first things machine learning engineers learn when they're taking their first machine learning course. And yet, this is surprisingly common. So this is a paper by Russell Polrak and others at Stanford. And they found that they looked at 100 different papers that use machine learning. And of those 100, 45 of these papers committed this error. They did not separate the training and test set. Another example of leakage is using an illegitimate feature for whatever task you're trying to do. So in this example on the slide, let's say you want to predict when a new patient comes into the hospital, will this patient get hypertension in the next few years? And you use 3 different data points to train this model. You use the fact that they have past health ailments, you use the patient's age, but then you also use a feature about whether the doctor has already ordered hypertension medicine. Now, as you can imagine, if a doctor has already ordered hypertension medicine, then it's basically useless to predict if a patient will get hypertension. It's almost as if we are sort of putting in the answers into the features. And so when we train a model with this data set, it is likely to do very well in our estimation, but in the real world, it might not work as well. And now, again, this might sound like a silly example, but we have seen exactly this happen in popular implementations of clinical AI. So in this case, models that were predicting when a patient would get hypertension used antihypertensive drugs as a feature. In fact, a follow-up study found that of the 6 most important features, 5 of them were antihypertensive drugs. And finally, a third example of leakage is when a model trained on one population is then evaluated or used on another one. And basically, if you're not accounting for this fact when building the model, this can lead to leakage. One simple example of this that we've seen is, you'll often have a model that's trained, let's say, on books in English or texts in one language, and it is then used to say that this model does well on all languages. Another example also from the healthcare setting is when COVID-19 happened, a number of researchers rushed to predict the onset or diagnose or prognose COVID-19 using chest x-rays. And many of these papers claimed extremely high accuracy at detecting whether someone has COVID-19 based just on the chest x-rays alone. However, when we look back at these things, and this was a wonderful study by Michael Roberts and others at at Cambridge, they found that all of the examples of people who had COVID came from adults. But all of the examples of people who did not have COVID, so all of the images of chest x-rays of people who did not have COVID came from children. And so what the model had essentially learned was to distinguish between chest x-rays of children and adults. It had not learned anything beyond that point. And yet this was sold as if we can accurately predict who has COVID from the chest x-rays. In fact, when we try to build models, we have errors that are far more benign creeping into these models all the time. For example, some other people tried to predict whether someone has pneumonia based on their chest x-rays. Instead of learning the patterns in a chest x-ray that lead to signals of pneumonia, the models essentially learned what the hospital token was on the top right-hand side. And based just on this token alone, based on the token that a clinician might put on the top right of the chest x-ray, the model was guessing whether the patient has pneumonia or not. So in other words, this is another example of models sort of cheating or teaching to the test when it comes to using AI to detect patterns. And so we decided to sort of analyze this trend systematically to go beyond these few handpicked examples and to figure out how common it indeed is, like how common is leakage in this type of task. And we found that leakage is widespread across scientific fields. This includes political science, medicine, the law, computer science, and so on. Over 600 papers are affected by leakage across 30 different fields. Now, why is leakage so common, especially in areas like legal research or scientific research, in general in like research fields that use science? We have a sort of hypothesis for why it's actually much worse for this type of research compared to applications that are then deployed in the wild. And that is because when we are doing engineering applications, that is, let's say, building a product that we are selling in the world using AI, there are like three main steps. You build the product, you validate it on some data, and then you deploy it in the real world. And crucially, if there's an error in the model, there are many mechanisms for getting feedback, let's say customer feedback, or people have channels for giving feedback to the company, which basically tells the company when the errors arise. And that allows companies to sort of fix these errors quickly in production. So basically, there's a tight feedback loop of how quickly these errors can be fixed. In contrast, when we're using machine learning for research tasks, we still have the first two phases exactly the same. You build the model and you validate it on some data. But the third phase is actually publication. You publish a paper, and then in most cases, researchers forget about whatever they did like a year ago. There are no real mechanisms for correcting errors in machine learning-based science. And as a result, errors can take a long time to uncover and challenge. And what this usually leads to is a false sense of consensus in a field, where many researchers believe that AI can actually be used to solve consequential tasks in their field, perhaps better than previous methods could. And as a result, I think leakage has led to this widespread but erroneous belief that AI can solve extremely difficult tasks across these fields. Okay, and we come back now to the third sort of factor that explains the difference between the hype and reality when it comes to tasks involving creativity and judgment. So the third example, or the third reason why there's a big difference between the hype and the reality, is that benchmark tasks are not the most useful way to evaluate AI. So here's what I mean by benchmark tasks. In the past, the field of AI has used tasks where a specific set of questions might be asked to different AI models. And all of these models are judged on the basis of how well they respond. Now, it turns out that for the latest wave of language models, even though these benchmark evaluations, such as, like the bar exam in the US law context, even though they're very convenient to conduct, you just have to administer a set of multiple choice questions, they're not very useful. And this is because of three reasons. The first is something we just saw, leakage. Language models are trained on huge amounts of data. And when you evaluate a model that is trained on basically all of the data from the internet, it might already have seen the specific exact questions that you're about to ask the model during the benchmark evaluation. A second issue with benchmark evaluation is construct validity. That is, the questions used in a typical benchmark evaluation, such as the bar exam, they don't reflect what a lawyer actually does in their day-to-day. After all, it's not a lawyer's job to answer bar exam questions all day. They do many things beyond this, and that is not accounted for by evaluating AI on benchmark tasks alone. A third issue with language models is that very small changes to the way these questions are asked, or even the orders in which the subparts of a question might be arranged, can lead to large changes in how well a model might answer. So this basically means even if you just switch around the order of the question, the formatting of the question, the style or grammar of the question, that alone is enough to change whether a model gets the right answer or not. So in order to improve this type of evaluation, one of the things AI companies can do is to offer transparency reports. So transparency reports are like reminiscent of social media platforms, where most social media platforms these days talk about how often platforms are used for certain kinds of tasks and so on. And similar reports for how users of language models use these models could help address concerns around prompt sensitivity, because we'll figure out what specific sort of types of applications are language models actually being used for in the real world. A second direction to improve evaluation, and that's where I think a lot of the people in this room might come in, is in improving the collaboration between AI experts and legal experts. So one of my favorite examples of this is this benchmark called Legal Bench. This was developed as a collaboration between lawyers, legal experts, and AI experts who came together to figure out how well AI can actually do in a lot of different types of legal tasks. And I think we'll need a lot more of such evaluation going forward if you're to actually understand the impact of AI on the legal profession. I'll just quickly mention one more example of an evaluation that I came across recently and I really liked, which is an evaluation of hallucinations in the tools created by leading US legal tech companies. So this was a paper led by Varun Magesh at Stanford. And this basically gives a set of like example hallucinations in Westlaw's legal AI tool. You can see in each of these cases, there is like a specific aspect of things that goes wrong when it comes to the answer outputted by Westlaw. And most importantly, the way to sort of tell that there's something went wrong here was for domain experts, like legal experts in this area, to evaluate the outputs of language models. There is no way, like someone like me, for instance, who works on AI but not in the law, could have figured out that there were like small but consequential mistakes in each of these answers. And I think the worrying thing here was they found that in almost a third of the cases, leading AI tools hallucinate. So like around 33% of the cases are affected by hallucination. Okay, so to quickly recap this section, there are many reasons why we have a difference between the hype and reality when it comes to tasks that are consequential in AI. And so for tasks that are like, involve creativity, reasoning, and judgment, evaluating AI is really hard, but it's also necessary for us to understand how well AI systems actually work. Okay, and this brings me to the third and final part of the talk, which is about a third category of applications involving predictions about the future. So one of the most prominent examples of such a task in the last few years has been criminal risk prediction. So this slide shows a screenshot of this groundbreaking investigation by ProPublica. It's a news organization in the US that found that risk prediction algorithms in criminal justice can be biased against Black people. Now, what stood out to me from this investigation was not just the fact that there's a lot of bias, but also that the accuracy of these systems is really, really low. So the accuracy of the tool used in this case, which is Compass, was around 65%. And more shocking than that, like 50% is just generating a response at random by flipping a coin. But more shocking than that was that while this algorithm is using 137 features about a person, the accuracy of this algorithm was the same as asking like a layperson whether a particular defendant would go on to recidivate. In fact, a follow-up study found that this algorithm was no more accurate then a very simple formula, which had just two variables, a defendant's age and their number of priors. So in fact, getting rid of the algorithm, which has like over 100 features, which is mostly a black box, and replacing it with just the age and number of priors could be a far better solution in terms of transparency and also in terms of holding the accuracy at line. And actually, a lot of people would argue that incorporating age into recidivism prediction is illegitimate because you have biases based on how old a person is. You might also want to have some moral leniency for defendants who are younger and therefore might be considered less culpable. And so if you remove age, we are left with just a very simple rule, which is the more the number of your priors, the more likely you are to sort of recidivate. And instead of using this very simple terminal or very simple formula, we've sort of gone on to using extremely complicated black box models that no one can really sort of decipher. And once again, I want to highlight the fact that it's not as if this model is some perfect oracle for the future, because then we would be having a different discussion. This model still just has an accuracy of around 64%, and yet it is considered to be good. And, we're using this algorithm to make life-changing decisions about defendants. So I think the moral of this particular story is predicting risk based on current data is really, really hard. Now, this is sort of one example in the criminal justice domain. A second area where predictions are also being used in the law are in predicting code decisions. So for instance, here on the screen, you can see an example of such a recommendation where computers are sort of being assigned to predict judicial decisions. Now, the key thing about this is an example from 1963. That's right. So for over 60 years at this point, we've been trying to use computers to predict the outcomes of judicial decisions. So how well have we actually done? Well, thanks to this recent survey by Medvedev et al., we actually have the answer. The whole line of research on predicting code decisions suffers from a number of basic flaws. So this paper by Medvedev et al. Looked at over 150 research studies aiming to predict the outcomes of code decisions. And they found that in the vast majority of papers, these papers suffer from errors. For example, in some cases, the AI model is given access to the answer, which leads to vast overestimates of performance. So one example of such an error is one of the documents that used as an input to the model is actually the judge's opinion or the verdict itself. Now, as you can imagine, predicting the outcome of a case based on the final opinion of a judge does not really count for much. And when people have tried to remove these errors and reevaluate AI, it turns out that AI is not really very good at predicting these outcomes. So for example, a model called Jury, which was used to make these predictions in advance of decisions, was only about 60% accurate. So very much like criminal risk prediction, it is not that much better than a coin flip. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the talk. As a quick recap, we looked at 3 types of applications: AI for information processing, creativity and judgment, and for predicting the future. The areas where there's most excitement about the use of AI is in tasks involving creativity and reasoning, as well as predicting the future, so the latter 2 tasks. But it turns out that these are exactly the areas where either current AI evaluations fall short, such as in the creativity and reasoning bucket, or AI does not perform very well at all. So for tasks involving creativity and reasoning, it's hard to evaluate these models because experts can reasonably disagree on the right answer. And this is where we need to do a lot more work in evaluations. And for tasks involving prediction, there is an inherent amount of uncertainty because the future is unknown. So we don't expect AI to get too much better at it. In contrast, in the first bucket, we have a lot more clarity on what the correct answers are, and therefore much better evaluations already, which is AI for information processing. But here, the improvement that modern AI methods offer over previous alternatives is incremental. It's an evolution and not a revolution. So the key main takeaways from this work are that to answer the question, what can we use AI for? We first have to answer the question, how was this system evaluated? And for all of the reasons mentioned on the slide, the current state of AI evaluation leaves a lot to be desired. And with that, I'll end my talk, and I'm very happy to take questions.